issue that happens here in the Eastern region in the state side, but it also happens with our Canadian partners. And so again, this I think is a really important conversation to have, and I'm glad that we're having it. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our vice chair to moderate the rest of this meeting. But one note is that if you want to be heard, we're recording for posterity. And if you want to be heard, you'll have to speak into a mic. And I'll do the mic running once we get there to that point, okay? Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Debbie, for your hard work, and thank you again. So we're going to have two discussions. One will be under panel discussion. It will be private criminal complaints as a solution to racialized public space. We're going to discuss remedies for race-based assaults against legislators of color. And then we're going to discuss racial matters in the legislative chamber. When they present, the speakers to my left, then we're going to have a Q&A. After that, we're going to have a second round. It will be a round table, which will be open to everyone that is present in the room today. And will be a discussion on race equity work in the provinces, states, and territories. This is an open discussion. Again, this is a safe space. We will then go on and discuss the committee work and the 2020 vision. To start, I just would like to say that our country has a long history with race. The diversity of our country is a tremendous strength. However, the ugly history of race is always a subcurrent or undertone of everything. So these speakers here today will help us address some of those issues. We're going to start first with the private criminal complaints, for those of you that want to follow the agenda, as a solution to racialized public space. We're going to start with Mr. Cord.
Thank you very much, and if you look at the agenda, it does state discussion topic as far as I'm concerned, private criminal complaints are a solution to racialized public space. And I want to break down what I mean by that, but I want to start out by stating that although I am an attorney and I've been practicing law for about 26 years, I specialize in capital murder cases, primarily death penalty cases involving police officers. So I've been doing this a very, very long time. But despite that, when I speak to audiences like this, I always say that I am not a lawyer who happens to be a black man. Instead, I'm a black man who just happens to be a lawyer. Far too often when black professionals get into certain fields, we believe that we have arrived, but we have not arrived, and that's the reality. And people often say, well, Michael, you always play the race card, it's always about race for you, and I say, yeah, that's right. And the reason why I say, yeah, that's right, because that's the history of this country. It's so funny because people look at the president, the quote-unquote president of the United States, and says that this is not America, this is an aberration. No, he's not an aberration. 60 million people voted for him. Despite what we know about him, and I'm not here to rant and rave about him, as a matter of fact, I actually have my stopwatch here because we have about 8 minutes. So here I am on my pedestal, yelling and screaming, and haven't even gotten to my topic yet, but I will get to it shortly. But my point is, when we look at America, what's going on the federal level and even on the state level is not an aberration. We look at this country and we talk about slavery. People think that, okay, that was just 246 years, 1619 to 1865. But it's not like at 1865, black folks got their freedom. You know, they were still sharecropping, they were still the redemption area, they were still peonage labor, they were still convict leasing, they were still Jim Crow, they're still today mass incarceration, police brutality. So when people said I played a race card, I don't get defensive, I simply ask them a question. And the question is this: if tomorrow you had to be a defendant in a criminal case, and all things being equal, but you could be a black defendant or a white defendant, which would you choose? It's 3 o'clock in the morning, you're leaving work late, driving up the street, lights and sirens, when the police car go off behind you, and as the officer approaches your vehicle, you could be a black driver at 3 a.m., or you could be a white driver at 3 a.m. Which would you choose? The answer is obvious. So yes, I do play the race card, and now I'm going to get into the topic. Here's the topic, something called private criminal complaints. A private criminal complaint is a legal tool in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and I'm sure elsewhere, that allows a private citizen to act as a public prosecutor. So when we see situations where white folks come after black folks because we Starbucks while black, we bus stop while black, we college dorm while black, we drive while black, we do all those things by black. In other words, we live while black. And you see white folks calling the police on us in connection with that. Well, there's a remedy to that. I'm a defense attorney, but I figured out a way to go on the offense in dealing with this kind of thing. It's really interesting because it didn't start with me trying to counteract white folks for bothering black folks for simply being black. It started out much bigger in terms of police officers killing people in Philadelphia. And here's the background, and I'll tell you how this private criminal complaint will work as an offensive tool to dissuade white folks from calling the police on black folks for no reason at all. Back in October of 1998, a black teenager named Dante Dawson was driving down 12th Street near Lehigh in North Philly. And for whatever reason, he stopped in the middle of the street, and a police car drove past him. And as it drove past him, there was a white officer who was the driver and a black officer who was the passenger. And the vehicle, the police car, passes Dante Dawson's vehicle about 4 or 5 car lengths ahead, and then it stopped abruptly. And the black officer gets out of the vehicle, walks back toward Dante Dawson, and tries to engage him in conversation, but no reaction. We found out later Dante Dawson had been smoking angel dust and was in a catatonic state, so he's just sitting there behind the wheel in the middle of the street. So the black cop tries to engage him in conversation, no response, he's just zombified. The black cop, when he approaches, has his hand on his gun, takes the gun out of the holster, approaches Dante Dawson, tries to engage in conversation, no response. The black cop puts the gun back in his holster, walks back to the police car. Conversation with the white cop for about 30, 40 seconds. Black cop gets out of the vehicle again, comes back to Dante Dawson, again tries to engage in conversation, no response, but the black cop says, okay, the guy's on drugs or something. Black cop puts the gun back in his holster, reaches over the steering wheel, takes the key out the ignition, and walks away. As he gets halfway back to the police vehicle, the white cop is now straddled across the hood of the police car, fires 2 shots into Dante Dawson's vehicle. First shot misses him, the second one goes into his right eye and comes out of his left ear, killing him instantly. And it's a very long, convoluted story, but I'm gonna wrap this up and maintain my 8-minute deadline. So long story short, the public prosecutor there, who was in bed with the police, I mean metaphorically in bed with the police, and the police could do no wrong, so she wouldn't file any criminal homicide charges against the officer. When I say criminal homicide, I mean that because in Pennsylvania there's 5 different types of homicide. You got 1st-degree murder and intentional killing, 2nd-degree murder, felony murder rule, 3rd-degree murder, you tried to hurt the person, but you killed the person, voluntary manslaughter, which means sudden and intense passion, and finally involuntary manslaughter, basically a reckless killing. So 5 different ways for a criminal homicide to take place. But the law in Pennsylvania is the law in every state, which is if you use a deadly weapon on a vital body part of a human being, the inference is murder. Deadly weapon, vital body part, gun, head, the inference is murder. But for whatever reason, we all know what it was, the DA first refused to file any charges against the cop and then tricked the black community because then she went after the cop for manslaughter. And the public thinks that all homicides are the same, and you see this DA going after this cop for manslaughter, but the fix was in. Because the judge was forced to dismiss the manslaughter charge because shooting somebody in the head with a gun is murder, not manslaughter. So the judge had to throw it. Now the judge looked like a bad guy. And the DA is now posturing to the media, and then because it was dismissed at the preliminary hearing stage and not the trial stage, the prosecutor can come back for a second preliminary hearing. If it were a trial, it would be double jeopardy. But it was a preliminary hearing, so the DA filed second manslaughter charges against that same cop with a different judge, and that different judge, the same thing, dismissed it. So now she looks like the hero, when really the fix was in. So what I did was I looked, and I'm sure I hope you chopped this down. Pennsylvania Rules of Criminal Procedure, Rule 504 and 506. It allows a private citizen to stand in the shoes of a public prosecutor. So when you read it, it says just that. Now, the legislative discussion about that before the rule came into effect, pretty much the assumption was that we're talking about minor incidents in the neighborhood, kids throwing a ball up against your window. You call the police say, sir, ma'am, it's just a kid with a ball, we don't have time for that, go downtown and file a private criminal complaint. But when you read Rule 504 and you read Rule 506, it doesn't limit you to what type of crime you're talking about. So I'm sitting there thinking outside the box, thinking like an angry black man and not a brainwashed lawyer. And I'm trying to figure, no disrespect to lawyers who might be in here, myself included, obviously. But so what I did was I said, okay, I'm going to file a murder charge against this cop. Because I'm looking at Rule 504 and 506, and I know what the DA does when my young black clients kill people with guns. So I took that same paperwork that's used against my young black client, whited out my client's name, address, all that, and just put the cop's information in there. And it all applied. The use of a deadly weapon on a vital body part of a human being with malice aforethought is first, second, or possibly third-degree murder. And filed a private criminal complaint. And on April 6, year 2000, we made history. Because for the first time in Philadelphia history, the first time in Pennsylvania history, as far as we know, the first time in American history, a white on-duty police officer was charged with the murder of a black person. Not an off-duty cop, not a black cop, not anything different apart from what I just said. An on-duty white police officer shooting and killing an unarmed black person and now facing murder. But it was a short-lived victory because the DA's office, and this is really crazy, the DA's office then hired an outside attorney to file an appeal to the Superior Court. Now remember, the DA's job is to prosecute, but went out and hired a top-notch defense attorney to appeal. It's even more convoluted than that because they went out and got this guy when I first filed the complaint, and he filed something called a King's Bench application. And a King's Bench application is when you can bypass the lower courts and go straight to the state Supreme Court. But it has to be an extremely politically important issue. So they went out and got this big-time lawyer, filed a King's Bench application. I gotta admit, I then went out and got the biggest black attorneys in Philadelphia history. At the time, we had the Chancellor of the Bar Association. We drafted him. We had Charles Bowser. We drafted him. We had a former retired U.S. attorney. So we had, it looked bad in court because all the black lawyers over here and all the white lawyers over here. The black lawyers fighting for the black people, the white lawyers fighting for the white people. That was the reality. And even some news reporters said that the visuals were not good in the courtroom. But it is what it is. So anyway, they filed this King's Bench application to say that the trial court should not have done what it did, but to my surprise, the Supreme Court rejected it and said, no, we're not going to hear that. And then the DA went out and went the normal route, because you go from the Court of Common Pleas to the Superior Court to the Supreme Court. They tried to bypass the King's Bench and go straight to the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court told them, no, go back to the drawing board. Long story short, the Superior Court got the case, overruled, reversed, vacated my win. And the reason why they vacated it is, and at first I was upset with the family of Dante Dawson, the decedent. The problem is, when I tried to get the family to allow me to represent them to lock the cop up for murder, they had already retained a civil lawyer to sue the city. And the civil lawyer told them not to go anywhere near me because that would undermine their ability to get some money. I don't think that lawyer gave a damn about Dante Dawson, and certainly didn't give a damn about justice for the family. And even at the end of the day, the mother and father probably got about $200,000, $300,000 for the death of their son. So anyway, long story short, what does that have to do with the topic here? And in the next 3 minutes, I'm going to tell you. Private criminal complaints as a solution to racialized public space. There are crimes that you can charge harassing people with, just like there are crimes that the DA's office can charge harassing people with. Primarily, we're talking about filing a false police report. So if somebody calls the police on you, they called about a crime you committed. So you can actually, under section 4906 of the Pennsylvania Crimes Code, file a private criminal complaint against that person for filing a false police report. even if people, and I'm uncomfortable even suggesting that because I don't like the idea of people getting arrested, black or white, don't like the idea of people going to jail. So for me, it's more of a chilling effect. That if folks know that they could, forget about the civil lawsuit, people pay money every day. I'm talking about a private criminal complaint charging that person with violating section 4906. And even going beyond that, there's other laws in Pennsylvania that white people violate every day. My final 30 seconds, there's spitting on the sidewalk. That's a crime in Pennsylvania. If you see a white person spit on the sidewalk, you could be as much of an asshole to them as they are to black people by calling the police and say, hey, if this happened in Philly, call the police and say, they violated Philadelphia Code, Chapter 10, Section 601. And then we go beyond that. Jaywalking is a crime. You see a white person jaywalking, you can call the police. Public drunkenness under Section 5505. You can go to South Street in Philly every day and round up a bunch of people. Displaying an unclean flag is a crime under Section 2101, Volume 21 of the Pennsylvania Code. Not providing your ID while going into an R-rated movie theater is a crime. I mean, as ridiculous as all that sounds, and it is ridiculous, how much more ridiculous is standing in a college dorm when you're a student there, buying coffee at Starbucks, going to the mall? So my suggestion at this point is that the situation is so egregious, and it gets worse every day. I mean, I thought that everything kind of subsided after the whole Starbucks thing, but you see more and more instances of this. So as drastic as some of my solutions might be, we need to at least consider it so that people will know that by harassing black people and getting them arrested, one, you could be charged with the crime, and two, black people can listen to what I'm saying and walk around with the crimes code and look for white people to violate anything and then start calling the police. It's ridiculous, it's crazy, but something has to be done. And thank you all for letting me go like 7 minutes beyond my deadline.
Thank you so much, Michael. It's always fascinating to hear about the amazing work that you're doing. So, and yeah, so on the factor of time, I think I want to go ahead and just say up front, you don't have to time me. This is a really, really important conversation that for some folks in the room is probably the first time you've really dug deep, so it's going to take the time that it takes. I'm recognizing that we do have other things happening in the world.
Well, if I may, there's another section that we have a round table, so we are gonna, I have already decided we're gonna be flexible on this, okay?
Perfect, thank you, I appreciate that. So, and I'm grateful that you all are willing to go on this journey. So, thank you very much for welcoming me to share with each of you today. I want to acknowledge that today we are gathered here on occupied indigenous lands. The indigenous blood that was spilt on the sacred ground in the name of God and greed by invaders, it set the foundation for all of the gross inequalities, the racism, the imperialistic and colonial ideologies, the genocidal acts and government-sanctioned violations of human rights that we're all trying to fight each and every day. This is the legacy of living history, and it continues to be enacted in each of our names across the globe. And as such, there is little that we're going to discuss today that should really be a surprise to you, as it's our shared history. So those of you who are familiar with my work know that I'm not one to shy away from difficult conversations and hard truths. The reality is that there's an urgency and a lethality to fostering comfortable conversations about the deadly impacts of systemic racism and institutionalized oppressions. So we're not going to do that today. That said, it is my pleasure to enter this dialogue with so many of you. And like you, I believe strongly in the power of local elections and appointments and their ability to fundamentally shape the everyday lived experiences of those here in the United States. And we often turn our eyes, as mentioned before, to national conversations and are deeply invested in those narratives that are coming from the federal government about issues of race, inclusion, and citizenry. But what you and I know well is that the policies, the culture, and the bureaucracies of our local and state governments is where the abstract becomes concrete and the visions become reality at rates exponentially faster than anything that can be produced from our national systems of bureaucracy. And I can't really speak about this dynamic without naming the cyclical moment we're in of rampant racism, xenophobia, bigotry, anti-Semitism, homophobia, transphobia, anti-immigrant, Islamophobic, anti-poverty, and markedly ableist movements of political and physical violence right now. So what happens in the halls of your state capitals, our school board meetings, our city councils, is a reflection of the values of our nation and the implementation of an agenda that seeks to maintain power and control over its people by any means necessary. So, as an individual, as we move into these, as a person of color, as we move into these white spaces of power, you're ever cognizant of the scrutiny that you're underneath regarding everything from your choice of clothing to the tone of your commentary, your interrogations on the floor, your presentations. To be taken seriously, you have to be aware of the rules of decorum. And you have to ascribe to the politeness protocol in most of your dealings. Now, in the Vermont House of Representatives, each convening begins with a commentary, a poem, a clerical message, or some other, or music, for example, as what they call devotions. And sometimes these devotions bring a large crowd of legislative listeners, but sometimes the room is nearly empty. Depends on the needs of those that are elected. I recall very clearly a morning where a fellow legislator delivered the devotional. It was beyond problematic. It was insulting to listen to. And of the few people who were there in the chamber that day, a few legislators, white men, turned their chairs to show their backs to the speaker. Now, to my novice eyes, that move seemed really openly disrespectful. Right? Now, my friend and seatmate, we decided that the most polite thing that we could do at that moment was to quietly stand and to leave the chamber. My friend and I were later admonished by veteran legislators for our break in the decorum. There was only quiet outrage at the subject of that speech, but the disappointment and concern was about our actions that day. Now remember the story, because it's important. For the last 3 years, the Vermont House has passed a resolution declaring Black Lives Matter Day. It's a day where many different activist organizations from throughout the state and affinity groups come together to show solidarity with the Black community and to show opposition to police brutality. And every year, the passing of the resolution causes some white legislators to go on record with their beliefs about it all. And it's very bothersome practice for some of them that each year they have to listen to this, what they believe is false rhetoric. During my last year, they took it to the next level. One freshman legislator came prepared with false data to try and repudiate every single whereas clause of this symbolic resolution, and peppered his speech with phrases like, quote, "I'm happy to affirm the humanity of every American, in fact, every human being, but I cannot concur with the assertion that in this resolution, it states African Americans face deadly oppression." Another would go on record stating, quote, "I would like to acknowledge the disproportionate number of Black unborn children that have been aborted in our country that would have been included in the numbers of Black lives that matter," unquote. As one colleague tried to counter with facts and in reading of the names of Black individuals who've been killed by police in the US, dozens of white members got up in the middle of his speech and left the chamber. No calls for order, no reprimand of any sort, none. Those comments were so horrid that the special guests of our house that were in the chamber, sitting in our ceremonial seats, all of whom were people of color and included youth, began to weep. They had to sit there and listen to these elected officials deny their very humanity as if they were not there. Those members of the public left those chambers without hearing any defense for themselves and of their humanity. because they were people of color. Now, I fully acknowledge that as the second whitest state in the Union, Vermont is definitely unrehearsed at dealing with issues of race, just as much so as any other state in this country. But this was a moment where the rules were clearly different. So this same representative would go on to say this to the press, quote, Representative Morris is entitled to her opinions, but her charge of racism is too casually made. If you failed to challenge her on the accuracy of the statements in that resolution, which many of you in the press did, but what I did, then you might want to think about your role as a reporter. Too many decent people from both parties thanked me for my comments by saying what, quote, courage it took to make them. What a sad comment on public discourse this is, end quote. So let's pay attention to who the decent people were and who those that showed courage were in this sort of insidious type of statement. And just for good measure, let me just make it clear that Black Lives Matter. So early into my biennium, as one of the second biennium I should say, as the only Black woman serving in the state legislature, second in the entire state history, I had met a young Haitian immigrant who was adopted and living in the community by white parents, and she'd come to the state house to come visit, having no idea that I was there. She was beyond thrilled to have an opportunity to meet someone who looked like her, who was in this position of power. And unfortunate as it was that we took this picture underneath Abraham Lincoln, it really struck both of us of the poignancy of that moment. I came to know her family, we became friends, and I actually even had the pleasure of living across the street from her while I rented a house during the session. Fast forward 2 years. I'm now fully into my second term, still reeling from the online racial harassment, threats, and intimidation from white nationalists and local bigots who decided to make me the face of all the gun legislation in the state. If you don't know this story, just Google my name. You can't find pretty much anything else other than this narrative right now. Now, interestingly enough, even though I sat on the Judiciary Committee, none of those were my bills. I was not the lead sponsor. I didn't present them on the floor. I was one vote of several. And that push for reform came from our white governor, not from me. It was all a result of a thwarted school shooting that had happened. Those bills were led by white men colleagues. So this local harassment then took a statewide and national turn as the architects of my harassment overwhelmingly pressed the lines and the lies about me in every single Second Amendment online space and portal they could find. And so the threats grew, they reached the dark web. It was calculated, deliberate, and is still unceasing to this day. It was easy. A Black woman who came from Chicago to destroy Vermont. Not one call to cease the harassment or the outrageous positioning from any of my legislative colleagues as it related to the Second Amendment bill. And that is a really, really key piece of this story. No recognition that the danger of such narratives is exponentially larger because I am Black. And then the comments in the press and on the floor that were painted with rhetoric about Black on Black crime. One state senator actually went as far as to say that the state had become overrun with outsiders who were threatening true Vermonters' freedoms. Lazy tropes rooted in a nativism and a racist sort of ideology. No one called a point of order on him, challenged the senator's hideous lines, and so I tweeted my anger about it. Weeks later, my mentee, remember the little girl? She came to see me, so very excited to spend the day with me. And she and I were enjoying a very pleasant lunch together in the cafeteria. On this day, that senator finally became aware of my tweets and chose to create a confrontation in plain view of the entire legislative lunch area. He came face full of fury and unrighteous indignation to tower over us with his 6'4" frame and scream about how I was the racist. I could not counter him with a softer tone. Pointing out that I had a youth as a guest would not stop his rant. Even her tears were insufficient for him or any of the other white folks that were in that room to say or do anything in that moment. Can you imagine the multiple lessons on racism and sexism that little girl learned at the hands of our state government that day? Imagine this young woman who came to see her hero being treated in such a manner without any repercussions. I consoled her as much as I could, and then I left. Fortunately, there was a brave ally who did see all of those things and called the speaker and the pro tem and demanded an apology from him. So he was forced to sit outside the speaker's office and wait for that young girl to write a gorgeous letter to come out of an 11-year-old and name exactly what that impact was on her life. He was never actually required to apologize to me, and we haven't spoken a word to each other ever since. So I can recall those physical sensations, even, of rising from my turn to speak in response to racist comments that were happening about immigration or about the detention camps, about fair and impartial policing, and being ignored or being forced to speak last because they were worried about my tone. Or perhaps it was the time when I sat with the only two other colleagues of color, including Representative Christie there, in our legislative lounge as we were composing a letter to our leadership about a bill on racial inequality in the state government. And we composed this letter because the solutions that were being proposed were the wrong ones, and it did not reflect our recommendations nor those of the stakeholders. It simply was just not a good bill in its form. And I recall the most powerful senator coming over to us and saying, "Why can't you just be happy? We're gonna pass your bill." How stunning that the only 3 people of color in the House chamber are telling you it's wrong, and we're told to swallow the concession. So at its core, these dynamics, they silence good legislators of color, and they maintain systems of unequal access to power in these places. So this is what we have to fight against. So as I'm here to answer this question about what are some of the solutions, I'm going to tell you that we're still needing to figure those out. But at the very heart of what was happening within my life, and what continues to be a concern that I have for many of our brave leaders who are stepping into these spaces of power, is literally their safety. If the state house is not safe, where security should be of most paramount interest, then what protections do they have outside of those walls? And I'm not just talking about having more armed guards or having metal detectors. Literally, we were told in this space, through the actions and inactions of those in power, that we were not safe, our voices were not safe, they were not welcome, and that we should cease to have our voice. That is of a concern, because then when you raise these concerns about what happens from the outside, as those folks on the dark web threaten to kill you, threaten the lives of your family, is anyone going to take you seriously? Because they didn't in that space where they should know better. So we don't know the scope of our own pain. So sometimes asking us what the solution is really hard. It's hard for us to name what's happening in these moments. And so it is going to need to be very specific to each area. But I suggest you start talking about it. We don't prosecute for racial threats, but we will prosecute for violations of firearms. And if you don't know what that means, again, Google my name and see what's happened in the last week or so. We can go to the Supreme Court for that, but we can't go to the Supreme Court to determine whether or not racial bias, harassment, and threats are something that is deserving of a second look by our criminal justice system. So, that was my time. I thank you for that.
Thank you so much for your story and for your honesty. We really appreciate it. Next.
Thank you. And doesn't it make you feel a little bit uncomfortable when you talk about race? And I'm going to bring this back to are given the right to legislate other people's right. And sometimes when we get under that dome, some of them are the same people that I've met when you were knocking on doors and saying that I'm going to work for you. You forget that. Remember, I'm a legislator, and I don't play one on TV. With that said, as you young ones that I see entering into this field, and as we start and get moving along, understand that at any given time, you're gonna have to get up and stand up and say something is wrong. I commend every white person that's in this room right now, because you took the time to listen, to hear my plight. I'm no different than you are, no better than you are, but I have a story to be told and to be understood. It's getting all lost in the minutiae in this time of Trump. And let me say, some of my best friends are Republicans, that we're being relegated down to next to zero, because I'm afraid to speak up, to say what is wrong, to say what is right, to let you understand that when I say something, I mean it. And I don't mean to be insulting. Please understand that. And if I singled you out for being white, it's because I love you. Because I need to work with you. Because you hold a lot more cards than I do. So I need to work with you. But if you're in this room right now, it's because you're willing to work with me. But as a legislator, we have the responsibility to legislate. And when we do this with the mindset, you already know I'm black, but most importantly, that I have an outcome for the people who came before me and the people who are behind me that have no voice at all. Remember, it's always worked, and I don't mean to be insulting, for the people who are in power. I'm just starting to get there to make it work for the people who are next to me. I don't mean to steal anything or take anything from you. I just want to be part of the scenario. I want to be heard. And I had this happen in my chamber, and that's why I say chambers are very, very much important. We're during Black History Month in my chamber. One of my colleagues was speaking on a Black history topic. And for some apparent reason, the speaker whatever, decides to cut him, or cut his time. Now mind you, I saw Armenian time, Irish time, Italian time, you name it, but that's what the chamber's for, celebrating everybody. But to shut off my time during Black History Month, I took offense. I got up and I made it known. But I was out of order. And there's no way I should be out of order for speaking or listening to my people. But I was out of order. So I say to you, senators and representatives, as you get to your chamber, do not ever forget, and I mean this, that you were given the right to speak on behalf of many people. You're the only ones with a seat. And there's no such thing as you're out of power, you're not in favor, unless the people unelect you. And once you're unelected, then get in line and ask someone like me to keep fighting for what you believe in. I am grateful to be here today and to be asked to come here. I'm a little disappointed it's on a Sunday. And it should be like probably in the middle of this conference so that people can pop their heads in as they move from chamber to chamber to hear what's actually happening. I will tell you, we are in some trying, terrible times in this era of Trump. But it doesn't mean we need to lose ourselves or forget what we're part of. We're all Americans in this. Every one of us. I can't go back anywhere, and you ain't putting the chains on me to go back. But I will tell you, I am proud from where I came from, proud to be here, and proud to be an American, and I never want anyone to forget that. But you young legislators, and you older ones also, because sometimes they're silent. I just wanna go, I don't keep my seat. It's more than that, and don't ever forget that. I thank you for your time, I thank you for being here, and I thank each and every one in this room just listening to me, but taking what I said today and using it elsewhere. Thank you so very much.
I want to thank each and every one of you for your honesty, for sharing your experiences. We feel it. I also want to thank CSG for having this discussion, even though it's on a Sunday, that we're finally having this discussion. So Debbie, thank you for that. We are actually now going to combine the questions and answers in the roundtable. So it's going to be just going around having a candid discussion. I want to start by asking, and we're going to try to find some solutions, recommendations, so that people can go home and think about them and implement them. So my question, and then I'll open it to everyone else, is how does a legislator of color represent communities of color without getting pigeonholed? You are representing everyone else in the community, borough community, but if you're the only one, or you're one of a few, how do you speak up? Where do you find the courage? Who would like to take that?
I want to say, you already had the courage once you got elected. You took the time to stop, to go to your community, to ask somebody to vote for you, and you win that election. There's your courage. And if you forget your courage when you get under that dome, then you should have never went there in the first place. I know it's difficult, and it's hard because we all want to get along on a few things, and understand that I gotta work this process. Don't lose yourself. And that simply said, don't lose yourself. I may disagree with you at times, but I respect you.
Thank you for that. I think similarly, this is something that I say in a lot of candidate trainings that I do. This is some of the most rewarding and amazing work that you can do, that a person can have the opportunity to do. It is also crushing. And if you do not stand strong in your principles, all you have at the end of the day is yourself and the decisions that you make. And you're not always going to get them right, but if you are not standing strong in your truth and in speaking those truths, that moment will not come again, and all you will have left are votes on a piece of paper. So make it count, because you're going to be you're going to be attacked. You'll be loved and you'll be attacked. You're going to be you'll be critically analyzed, as you should be. And so you need to feel really strong about yourself and what you're saying. And so you are already doing that representation, whether you want to or not. So wear that.
Thank you. So we're going to open it up for the rest of the people that are participating here. As you ask your questions, or if you have any suggestions on any race and equity work in your provinces, in your states or territories, will you be so kind and share it? Again, this is a safe space. We're not judging. It's just a candid, honest discussion, and I am reinforcing it so that everyone can feel comfortable about sharing. Are there any questions? This is not a shy group.
Okay, wait, 1 second, I'm going to, Debbie's going to bring the mic to you, and then we'll proceed in that manner.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me share. First of all, I want to say I commend you, all of you, for what you are doing on behalf of your constituencies and the movement. I must say I can feel your pain. I'm coming from the Virgin Islands. We don't have those type of issues. But nonetheless, we have controversial issues, and what I do and what I always promise to do from day one, like the young man said, When I went, I knocked on almost every door in the territory. I told them I want to work on their behalf. And that's what I do. I do the right thing. I don't worry about my job. Because I realized despite the threats, the marches, even when we did the same tax bill in March, by the thousands, I said, well, I'm picking out, but I still voted the right way. And at the end of the day, I still came in number one because, believe it or not, many of the individuals don't support you because they know you're doing the right thing on their behalf. So, stay in the fight and continue to do the right thing, and God is good, He'll look out for you. Because once you do what He actually do, He's gonna look out for you. And that's my advice. Thank you.
Thank you. When you speak, comment, or ask a question, would be so kind and introduce yourself and state your come from. Thank you.
I'm Thomas Frank from the state of Maryland, House Delegate. I commend each of you for your bravery in saying all that you shared with us. And but I just want to just add something to the agenda, if you don't mind. While this is a very, very important issue, and I just want to add something else to the agenda. In my district, as in many other districts, we have a number of murders right in the Black community. Baltimore is pushing somewhere near 300. We did 350 last year, another 3-something the year before that. So the impact of what's happening in the Black community are things that I would hope that we could get to discuss. I would like at least to have that added to the agenda, because I don't know what to do. The police department of Philly doesn't know what to do. The council doesn't know what to do. So we are the bright minds in here. Maybe we can come up with some things that could actually help with lessening the impact that this is causing to so many people in the country. It's the Black communities that have the highest amount of murders, the highest amount among them within this country. So it is up to the great minds of all of us from around the country to begin to look at stuff like that. The other issue that I like to add is one that I heard recently about Rhode Island, and in Baltimore, and in Washington, D.C., that the young people, the youth, are now beginning to jump on individuals and cause assaults. Just beat them just because. Look at them as a group, don't like that one individual that's walking down the street minding their own business, and then they're attacked. I don't know what professionals we could have come in to talk to us about that, to give us some guidance, to give us some thought to some things that we should be looking at and thinking and talking about. The professionals that could come in and share. So I'm just looking for answers, and I'm hoping, Mr. Chairman, that we could possibly, just as this is a very important issue that was just discussed, that we could certainly add those two elements, because those two elements are crippling the Black community. Thank you.
I have a point of correction.
Very quickly, and I do mean very quickly, I appreciate you raising that issue because it's an important one, but often because 99.9% of my clients who I represent and have for the last 25 years, 99.9% of them are young Black men. And people see them and say, wow, those young Black guys are committing all those horrible crimes. And that's not really true. Because, and you're absolutely right about the fact that the higher crime rates tend to be in the Black community, but when you dig deeper, it's something more fundamental. The highest crime rates are in the poorest communities.
Murder rate.
Well, in fact, I'm going to get to that in just a second. In fact, poor white people kill each other at a higher rate than poor Black people kill each other. So we can't fall for the okie dokie and believe the stuff that we see here in the media. I'm a prime example. I'm sitting here now as a lawyer and a college professor because of American racism. You can say, well, what do you mean? Isn't this a good thing that you're here as a lawyer? No. I was born and raised in North Philly. I went to a horrible public school. I got lucky in the 3rd grade and did well in the citywide test. What does the system do? They take me out of the horrible North Philly school, and they put me in Master. And now I'm on my way to college and law school and everything else. But what about Tyrone, who sat behind me at that school? What about Lakeisha, who sat in front of me? They would be here right now. And I venture to say that most of my clients who shoot and kill people, they would be sitting right here if they got the opportunity. Quick example, I had a horrible murder case, My client might have killed 2, 3, possibly 4 people. Long story short, after he's found guilty, we have the penalty phase. And the penalty phase is where the jury decides life or death. Well, we had some of the best investigators in the state to work with us. And the defendant was 24 years old. We couldn't find one person to say anything good about him. No baseball coach, no Boy Scout leader, no pastor, nobody. The only one we could find was his mother. And in my final few seconds, let me tell you what she said. She gets on the stand and says, when he was in me and I was pregnant, I was a crack-addicted prostitute with VD while he's inside me. And then as he's a toddler, I'm selling my body in the projects. He leaves the house at age 8 years old as a grown man and then goes into shoplifting, joyriding, selling drugs, and graduated to killing people. My point is that it's not these young, and you're not saying this, my point is that it's not these young black men who are the problem, it's the system that creates them. Many people think that that monster was Frankenstein. The monster was not Frankenstein. The monster had no name. Frankenstein was the doctor who created him. So when you see my young black clients doing these things, ask about what kind of education, what kind of job opportunities. And I venture to say that if you give 8 out of 10 of my past clients an education and a job, they wouldn't be my client.
Next, sir.
Thank you very much, and I can't say enough how much I applaud the courage and the ability to express yourself as well as you have, especially for anybody who's either the first or second anything, and if you're usually the only person in that particular caucus, it gets even more challenging. I'll speak for myself in Connecticut. We're one of 32 between the Black and Puerto Rican caucus, and I will put something out there that is usually never spoken of, because we can always say that they don't understand us. They don't really understand us. But I'm going to put it publicly. Sometimes black and brown people don't understand each other, and if we don't get in the room and try to solve our own issues, how can we now bring in a third entity or fourth entity? And it's very, very important, because the issues that we all suffer from are exactly the same. Lack of resources for education, lack of infrastructure costs, not enough minority teachers. It doesn't really matter what skin you are. The issues are still the same. I cannot applaud what this conference and what you guys bring to the table, and continue the struggles. We're all there. Thank you.
Next. Can you please tell us your name and where you come from? Getting your exercise today. You should borrow my Fitbit. I'm actually competing with my children, all 3 of them, and they always beat me every day. They reach 10,000 steps. I should give it to you. Go ahead, sir.
She's speeding today. Thank you very much. Marv Anthony from Rhode Island. I really appreciate, and in particular Brother Hall, who I serve with every day, and everybody else on the panel who gave some heartfelt stories. The only thing I want to put on the table is this, and I think the gentleman just said so. You got to remember, we're mostly all elected officials, which means that you've convinced a lot of people that there's something within you that will help get something done. And if I could say anything to, and I've not been around for a long time, but if I could say anything to the young legislators like Rep. Ho was saying, was that there's a difference between voicing your opinion and then getting something done after that. It's figuring out, what do I need to do to make a difference in my community. I grew up in Texas doing segregation. I now represent Newport, Rhode Island, where there's 0.5% black people and 99% of the people who voted for me are white. It doesn't mean I'll lose myself in representing everyone, but I represent everybody who's in my particular district. But the one thing I spent a lot of time doing was trying to figure out, what can I do right now I'm an old soldier. I believe in getting up every day and getting one thing done when I get up in the morning that's positive. If I get that one thing done, then the rest of the day, I know that it's gonna be okay. And if I can do that 365 days a week, 365 days in a year, I've got something done. But getting that something done has a lot to do with leaders. All of you are leaders. You're not followers. And the one thing I will suggest is that in programs like CSG has, the leadership program, or in CSL, there are a lot of ways that you can learn to be an effective legislator, because what you do and what you say affects a number of people. Part of it is making aware of how you feel, what the problem is, the same as you do your constituents. You listen to them, but you don't always get everything that they want at that point in time. You've got to learn how your chamber works, and then the other people who are in that chamber to get something done. I also agree that, people of color have to realize we are people of color and we're not all the same, but the goal that we're trying to get to is the same. Years and years ago, when my sister was in college in Central Texas, I sneaked in her dorm and stayed there for 6 weeks one time in the summertime. And Muhammad Ali visited that school, and he was talking to the students, and he said, America, when we go to war, we don't fight with just the Army, but we fight with the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marines. We have a concerted effort to get something done, and we do it differently, but it's the same thing. If we don't figure out what it is that we need to do to be effective, I'm not talking about the specific program, because I don't think you can legislate morality to the degree that you're going to change people's minds overnight. But I do think that if you learn how to be an effective leader and get one thing done that affects 50 other people, then exponentially you make a difference in kids' lives. And that's what I try to do in my position. And then the more you stay in the legislature and you work hard and get lucky and you get into the leadership role, the world looks completely different then too, but you can have a much bigger effect. So it's more than just letting it out, it's figuring out a strategy to get one thing done. Even if just one thing you get done that year, then exponentially I think it can make a difference. So that would be something I would put on the table so that we don't think that simply what we're doing here today and talking about it is the end result. We have to do something to get something done.
Thank you very much for your thoughts. We have Debbie on the corner. The young man, will you please introduce yourself? Thank you.
Hi, Angel Betancourt. I work for State Senator Sharif Street, representing North Philadelphia. And one of the biggest takeaways, I want to thank everybody for coming as well and speaking. One of the biggest takeaways I think is resources, right? And you think about communities of color. Me specifically, I was born and raised in the Bronx, and I was supposed to become a product of my environment, but luckily because of my mother and the people around me and the community, I am where I am today. But I think that touches on something really important, is resources, right? Community centers and where we're spending our money. And I believe someone said something about the military before, but on the national level, just look at the budget. We spend so much more money on our, in just military in general, but on our education system is so fractured. Resources is one of the biggest takeaways.
Will you be so kind and raise your hand so Debbie, it's easier for her, please?
Thank you, and I just want to chime in and thank you all for having the intestinal fortitude and courage to speak power to power. We often talk about speaking truth to power. We know the truth, and many people don't care about the truth. I just want to kind of chime in because it's already been said, but I will harp on opportunities and resources and why in poor communities, poor white and black, but disproportionately black communities, we're dealing with the crime and the black on black crime, shootings and murders and drugs and all the things that occur in poor communities. And that's because we need to raise the standard. When you look at communities, especially our communities, poor black struggling inner cities, It's substandard education, it's substandard healthcare, it's substandard economic stability. There is nothing. Our children have no summer programs, they have no summer jobs, and what they see, you can't be what you don't see. So what they see is the criminal mind. What they see are the people that have found a way to make a way out of no way. We have a saying, making $1 out of 15 cents. We've learned how to do that because of the oppression that this system has, this country was birthed in. You know, this is the America that we know. It's not un-American. It's who we are, and until we own that and tell the truth about it, and the folks like us around this table that have the power to do something about it, actually use that power to do something, we're gonna continue to sit at these round tables and have these conversations. So I would say that we need to raise the standard, and we need to talk about resources and opportunities, because nothing irritates me more than to hear the term achievement gap. Because the connotation is that Black and brown children do not have the ability to achieve, and that could not be further from the truth. It's about having a level playing field, having the same opportunities and resources so that, as the attorneys just spoke, he was able to do what he could do, his clients would be able to do the same thing. I have 2 children, one's 32, one's 25 now, and I can remember New Haven, Connecticut, born in Harlem, raised in Brooklyn and Queens, New York, been in Connecticut for 19 years. I brought that experience with me to the State House. And my son, I went through so much with him in the public schools. Highly intelligent kid, but was never challenged, just like his mother. I wasn't challenged. So, you get in the street, you learn to be entertained by things, you get sucked into certain groups. I wasn't gonna let that happen to my daughter. So what did I have to do? Instead of her going to school in New Haven, Connecticut, I had to bus her to Wallingford, Connecticut, so that she could get the foundation that I knew would make the difference when I brought her back for high school. Because I wanted her to have a diverse education, but I understood that the foundation of that education was gonna be, needed to be rooted and grounded in a neighborhood that didn't look like ours, because there was substandard education. And there were teachers that were teaching her that did not have the competency, the cultural competency to deal with who she was and what she brought when she arrived at school, and not just her. This is most Black and brown, I would say all Black and brown kids. We don't talk about the urban trauma. We don't talk about the things that our children go through mentally, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. What comprises communities of color, Black communities, Latina communities. And it's usually the melanin skin folks. Asian people come out a little better, a lot better. And then there's the white privilege. So I think that we really need to concentrate on addressing the real issues and stop dancing around and talking about what are the solutions, what should we do? We know what we need to do. We need people that have a backbone, that's gonna be willing to get it done. And how do I enter into the State House? I can remember the first year I was there, I suffered from imposter syndrome because I didn't believe that I deserved to be there. I didn't believe that I was qualified to be there. And it was quite intimidating because at the time it wasn't 31 and 32 of us. We've grown a few since I've been there. And we were expected to go along to get along, to just be skipping around the building and be happy to be in the building, but know your place. There were certain things that you can say and certain things that you couldn't say, and don't you dare upset or make anyone uncomfortable. A year after being there, the epiphany for me was, I realized it wasn't the experience that I was learning in the building that qualified me to be there. It was the experience that I had brought to the building that qualified me to be there. And that's how I stand and speak and have the courage to address the subliminal and not so subliminal anymore. They're quite blatant in the State House where I am. And it is racism. And I believe that we need to call it what it is, and it's a system. And the system is not broken. The system was designed to work exactly how it's working, and it doesn't need to be reformed, because if we be honest about it, prison was a reform. They took us off the plantation and they put us in the prisons. That's reform. Let's dismantle it. I don't believe that, we should have to go that route and still be dealing with the issues that we're dealing with in 2019 when we have someone in the White House is so blatant and so brazen about his bullying and his racism and the fact that there are Democrats and Republicans and maybe some independents in the White House that are radio silent on this, and silence is violence. And that's what we're seeing. So I say we get together, take what we're talking about and learning in this room and actually take it to the streets. It's gonna be a grassroots movement. I'm here to tell you, the revolution will not be televised. The way, at the rate we're going, it's going to be really, really ugly. 2020 is gonna be an interesting year, but I hope that it's white, black, brown, yellow, and I hate using colors, you know, it's something disturbing to me about that, but it's the narrative that we use, and you understand where I'm coming from. We need to get together collectively and work authentically and genuinely, and don't come to the table with a spirit of defense or offense. Just come with the truth, and let's be real with one another, and let's talk about being effective and getting it done. It's time to get it done. It's time to get it done. We've talked about it for centuries now. It's time for us to get it done. So I just would like to thank Debbie and everyone that's responsible for this roundtable for having us here today.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
And I'm not sure if I introduced myself, but I'm Robin Porter, State Rep from the 94th District, Camden, New Haven,
You
Connecticut.
notice I have not interrupted anyone because I want people to really have an honest discussion, but we do only have about 7 minutes left before we allow the staff to talk about the 2019-2020 work plan where some of these issues that have been brought up can be discussed. So let's go first, Debbie.
Hi, Chris Rabb, State Representative from Northwest Philly. I actually have a suggestion. In Pennsylvania, we amended the Pennsylvania Democratic House caucus rules. There are 4 caucuses. Pennsylvania has the largest full-time state legislature in the country. There's 203 of us on the House side, and our Democrats, we got together in November and we amended the caucus rules. We call it a caucus, some of you call it a conference, I think, to include equity provisions within how we do business as Democrats. This can be used by Republicans, this can be used in other caucuses, but it was accepted unanimously. And it talks about equity from a lot of standpoints, including procurement, legislation and policy, HR, appropriations, communications. So what are the words we're using to talk about equity? What are the words we need to avoid? What are the terms that put us in the wrong direction? So this is baked into what we're supposed to be doing as House Democrats. And so it's a public document, and I'm happy to share with anyone who would be interested in that.
Will you be so kind and send it to Debbie so she can send it to all of us, please? We have just 2 more questions left. 3? Okay.
Hi, I'm Kevin Coach Christie, and I'd like to thank you all. And I'd like to share a continuation of the story that I started. There were a number of bills that we worked on together, and I'm really proud of the work that